Hello and welcome to India Reads. I'm Pradeep and we are reading the story of my experiments with truth by M.K. Gandhi. We are in part 4, chapter 13, Indian Opinion, and let's start. Before I proceed with other intimate European contacts, I must note two or three items of importance. One of the contacts, however, should be mentioned at once. The appointment of Miss Dick was not enough for my purpose. I needed more assistance. I have in the earlier chapters referred to Mr. Rich. I knew him very well. He was a manager in a commercial firm. He approved my suggestion of leaving the firm and getting an article under me, and he considerably lightened my burden. About this time, Sergeant Madanjeet approached me with a proposal to start Indian Opinion and sought my advice. He had already been conducting a press and I approved of his proposal. A journal was launched in 1904 and Sergeant Mansuklal Nazar became the first editor. But I had to bear the brunt of the work for having most of the time to be practically be in charge of the journal. Not that Sergeant Mansuklal could not carry it on, he had been doing a fair amount of journalism whilst in India, and he would never venture to write on intricate South African problems so long as I was there. He had the greatest confidence in my discernment and therefore threw upon me the responsibility of attending to the editorial columns. The journal had been until this day a weekly. In the beginning, it used to be issued in Gujarati, Hindi, Tamil, and English. I saw, however, that the Tamil and Hindi editions were a make believe. They did not serve the purpose for which they were intended, so I discontinued them as I even felt that there would be a certain amount of deception involved in their continuance. I had no notion that I should have to invest any money in this journal, but I soon discovered that it could not go on without my financial help. The Indians and the Europeans both knew that even though I was not avowedly the editor of Indian Opinion, I was virtually responsible for its conduct. It would not have mattered if the journal had never been started, but to stop it after once it had been launched would have been both a loss and a disgrace. So I kept on pouring out my money until ultimately I was practically sinking all my funds into it. I remember a time where I had to remit £75 each month. But after all these years, I feel that the journal has served the community well. It was never intended to be a commercial concern. So long as it was under my control, the changes in the journal were indicative of the changes in my life. Indian Opinion in those days, like Young India and Navjeevan today, was a mirror of part of my life. Week after week, I poured out my soul in the columns and expounded the principles and practice of Satyagraha as I understood it. During 10 years, that is until 1914, excepting the intervals of my enforced rest in prison, there was hardly an issue of Indian Opinion without an article from me. I cannot recall a word in those articles set down without thought or deliberation, or a word of conscious exaggeration, or anything merely to please. Indeed, the journal became for me a training in self-restraint and for friends a medium through which they could keep in touch with my thoughts. The critic found very little to which he could object. In fact, the tone of Indian Opinion compelled a critic to put a curb on his own pen. Satyagraha would probably have been impossible without the Indian Opinion. Readers look forward for a trustworthy account of the Satyagraha campaign as also the real condition of Indians in South Africa. For me, it became a means for the study of human nature in all its casts and shades, as I always aimed at establishing an intimate and clean bond between the editor and the readers. I was inundated with letters containing the outpourings of my correspondents' hearts. They were friendly, critical, or bitter, according to the temper of the writer. It was a fine education for me to study, digest, and answer all this correspondence. It was as though the community thought audibly through this correspondence with me. It made me thoroughly understand the responsibility of a journalist, and the hold I secured in this way over the community made the future campaign workable, dignified, and irresistible. In the first month of the Indian Opinion, I realized that the sole aim of journalism should be service. The newspaper press is a great power, but just as an unchained torrent of water submerges whole countrysides and devastates crops, so an uncontrolled pen serves but to destroy. If the control is from without, it proves more poisonous than want of control. It can be profitable only when exercised from within. If this line of reasoning is correct, how many of the journals in the world would stand the test? But who would stop those that are useless? And who would be the judges? The useful and the useless must, like good and evil, generally go on together, and man must make his own choice. Coolie locations or ghettos. Some of the classes which render us as the greatest social service, but which we Hindus have chosen to regard as untouchables, are relegated to remote quarters of a town or a village, called in Gujarati Devado, and the name has acquired a bad odor. Even so, in Christian Europe, the Jews were once untouchables, and the quarters that were assigned to them had the offensive name of ghettos. In a similar way, today we have become the untouchables of South Africa. It seems to be seen how far the sacrifice of Andrews and the magic wand of Shastri succeed in rehabilitating us. Let's continue. The ancient Jews regarded themselves as the chosen people of God to the exclusion of all others, with the result that their descendants were visited with a strange and even unjust retribution. Almost in a way, the Hindus have considered themselves Aryas or civilized and the section of their own kith and kin as Anarias or untouchables, with the result that a strange, if injustice, nemesis is visited not only upon the Hindus in South Africa but the Muslims and Parsis as well, inasmuch as they belong to the same country and have the same color as the Hindu brethren. The readers will now have realized to some extent the meaning of the word locations with which I have headed this chapter. In South Africa, we have acquired the odious name of coolies. The word coolie in India means only a porter or a hired workman, but in South Africa it has a contemptuous connotation. It means what a pariah or an untouchable means to us, and the quarters assigned to the coolies are known as coolie locations. Johannesburg had one such location, but unlike other places with locations where the Indians had tenancy rights, here they acquired these plots on a lease of 99 years. People are densely packed in the location, the area of which never increased with the increase in population. Beyond arranging to clean the latrines in the locality in a haphazard way, the municipality did nothing to provide any sanitary facilities, much less good roads or lights. It was hardly likely that it would safeguard its sanitation when it was indifferent to the welfare of the residents. These two were ignorant of the rules of the municipal sanitation and hygiene to do with the help or supervision of the municipality. If those who went there had all been Robinson Crusoes, there would have been a different story. But we do not know of a single immigrant colony of Robinson Crusoes in the world. Usually, people migrate abroad in search of wealth and trade, but the bulk of the Indians who went to South Africa were ignorant, pauper agriculturalists who needed all the care and protection that could be given to them. Traders and educated Indians that followed them were a few. The criminal negligence of the municipality and the ignorance of the Indian settlers thus conspired to render the location thoroughly insanitary. The municipality, far from doing anything to improve the condition of the location, used the insanitation caused by their own neglect as a pretext for destroying the location and for that purpose obtained from the local legislature authority to depossess the settlers. This was the condition of things when I settled in Johannesburg. The settlers, having proprietary right in their lands, were naturally entitled to the compensation. A special tribunal was appointed to try the land acquisition cases. If the tenant was not prepared to accept the offer of the municipality, he had a right to appeal to the tribunal, and if the latter's award exceeded the municipality's offer, the municipality had to bear the cost. Most of the tenants engaged me as their legal advisor. I had no desire to make money out of these cases, and so I told the tenants that I should be satisfied with whatever cost the tribunal awarded. In case they won and a fee of £10 on every lease irrespective of the case, I also told them that I proposed to set apart half the money paid by them to the building of a hospital or similar institution for the poor. This naturally pleased them all. Out of about 70 cases, only one was lost. So the fees amounted to a fairly big figure, but Indian opinion was there with its persistent claims and devoured, so far as I can recollect, a sum of £1,600. I had worked hard for these cases. The clients always surrounded me. Most of them were originally unindentured laborers from South Africa, South India. For the redress of their particular grievance, they had formed an association of their own separate from that of free Indian merchants and traders. Some of them were open-hearted liberal men and had high character. The leaders were Sergeant Jairam Singh, the president, and Sergeant Badri, who was as good as the president. Both of them are now no more. They were exceedingly helpful to me. Sergeant Badri came in close contact with me and took a prominent part in Satuagraha. Through these and other friends, I came in intimate contact with numerous Indian settlers from North and South India. I became more their brother than a mere legal advisor and shared in all their private and public sorrows and hardships. It may be of some interest to know how the Indians used to name me. Abdullah Seth refused to refer me as Gandhi. None, fortunately, ever insulted me by calling me a Sahib. Abdullah Seth hit upon a fine appellation, Bhai, which is brother. Others followed him and continued to address me as Bhai until the moment I left for South Africa. There was a sweet flavor about the name when it was used by ex-endangered Indians. The Black Plague, Part 1. The Indians were not removed from the location as soon as the municipality secured its ownership. It was necessary to find the residents suitable new quarters before dislodging them. But as the municipality could not easily do this, the Indians were suffered to stay in the same dirty location, with this difference that their conditions became worse than before. Having ceased to be proprietors, they became tenants of the municipality, with the result that their surroundings became more insanitary than ever. When they were proprietors, they had to maintain some sort of cleanliness, if only for the fear of the law. The municipality had no such fear. The number of tenants increased, and with them the squalor and the disorder. While the Indians were fretting over the state of things, there was a sudden outbreak of black plague, also known as a pneumonic plague, more terrible than and fatal than the bubonic. Fortunately, it was not the location but one of the gold mines in the vicinity of Johannesburg that was responsible for the outbreak. The workers in this mine were for most part Negroes, for whose cleanliness their white employers were solely responsible. There were very few Indians working in connection with the mine, 23 of whom suddenly caught the infection and returned one evening to their quarters in the location with an acute attack of the plague. Sergeant Madanjit, who was then canvassing subscribers for the Indian Opinion and realizing subscriptions happened to be in this location at this moment. He was a remarkably fearless man. His heart wept to see these victims of scourge, and he sent a pencil note to me to the following effect: "There has been a sudden outbreak of the Black Plague. You must come immediately and take prompt measures, otherwise we must be prepared for dire consequences. Please come immediately." Sergeant Madanjit bravely broke open the lock of the vacant house and put all the patients there. I cycled to the location and wrote to the town clerk to inform him of the circumstances in which we had taken possession of the house. Sir William Godfrey, who was practicing in Johannesburg, ran to the rescue as soon as he got the news and became both the nurse and the doctor to the patients, but 23 patients were more than the three of us could cope with. It is my faith, based on experience, that if one's heart is pure, calamity brings in its train men and measures to fight it. I had at that time 4 Indians in my office: Sergeant Kalyandas, Maniklal, Gunwant Rai Desai, and other whose name I cannot recollect. Kalyandas had been entrusted to me by his father. In South Africa, I have rarely come across anyone more obliging and willing to render implicit obedience than Kalyandas. Fortunately, he was unmarried then, and I did not hesitate to impose upon him duties involving risk, however great. Maniklal and I had secured in Johannesburg. He too, so far as I can remember, was unmarried, so I decided to sacrifice all four, call them clerks, co-workers or sons. There was no need at all to consult Kalyandas. Others expressed their readiness as soon as they were asked. "Where are you? We also will be," was their short and sweet reply. Mr. Rich had a large family. He was ready to take the plunge, but I prevented him. I had not the heart to expose him to the risk, so he attended to the work outside the danger zone. It was a terrible night, the night of vigilant nursing. I nursed a number of patients before, but never any attacked by the Black Plague. Dr. Godfrey's plucks proved infectious. There was not much nursing required. To give them their doses of medicine, to attend to their wants, to keep them and their beds clean and tidy, to cheer them up was all that we had to do. The indefatigable zeal and the fearlessness with which the youths work rejoiced me beyond measure. One could understand the bravery of Dr. Godfrey and of an experienced man like Sergeant Madanjit, but the spirit of these young callow youths. So far as I can recollect, we pulled all the patients through that night. But the whole incident, apart from its pathos, is of such absorbing interest and for me of such religious value that I must devote to it at least 2 more chapters. The Black Plague too. The town clerk expressed his gratitude to me for having taken charge of the vacant house and the patients. He frankly confessed that the town council had no immediate means to cope up with such an emergency, but promised that they would render all the help in their power. Once awakened to a sense of their duty, the municipality made no delays in taking proper measures. Next day, they placed a vacant godown at my disposal and suggested that the patients be moved there. But the municipality did not undertake to clean the premises. The building was unkempt and unclean. We cleaned it up ourselves, raised a few beds and other necessaries through the offices of the charitable Indians, and improvised a temporary hospital. The municipality lent the services of the nurse who came in with brandy and other hospital equipment. Dr. Godfrey still remained in charge. The nurse was a kindly lady and would fain to have attended to the patients, but we rarely allowed her to touch them lest that she should catch the contagion. We had instructions to give the patients frequent doses of brandy. The nurse even asked us to take it for precaution, just as she was doing it herself, but none of us would touch it. I had no faith in its beneficial effect even for the patients, but with the permission of Dr. Godfrey, I put 3 patients who were prepared to do without brandy under the earth treatment, applying wet earth bandages to the head and chest. 2 of these were saved, the other 20 died in the go down. Meanwhile, the municipality was busy taking other measures. There was a lazaretto for contagious diseases about 7 miles from Johannesburg. The 2 surviving patients were moved to tents under the lazaretto, and arrangements were made for sending any fresh cases there. We were thus relieved of our work. In the course of a few days, we learned that a good nurse had had an attack and immediately succumbed. It is impossible to say how the 2 patients were saved, but we remain immune. But the experience enhanced my faith in the earth treatment and also my skepticism of the efficacy of brandy even as a medicine. I know that neither this faith nor the skepticism is based upon any solid grounds, but I retain the impression which I then received and will have therefore thought it necessary to mention it here. On the outbreak of the plague, I addressed a strong letter to the press holding the municipality guilty of negligence after the location came into its possession and responsible for the outbreak of the plague itself. This letter secured me Mr. Henry Pollock and was partly responsible for the friendship of the late Reverend Joseph Doak. As I've said in the early chapter that I used to have my meals at a vegetarian restaurant, here I met Mr. Albert West. We used to meet in this restaurant every evening and go out walking after dinner. Mr. West was a partner in a small printing concern. He read my letter in the press about the outbreak of the plague and not finding me in the restaurant felt uneasy. My co-workers and I had reduced our diet since the outbreak, as I had long made it a rule to go on a light diet during epidemics. In these days, I had therefore given up my evening dinner. Lunch also I would finish before the other guests arrived. I knew the proprietor of the restaurant very well, and I had informed him that I was engaged in nursing plague patients. I wanted to avoid the contact of friends as much as possible. I'm sorry, the pages are jumping today. Not finding me in the restaurant for a day or two, Mr. West knocked at my door early one morning just as I was getting ready to go out for a walk. As I opened the door, Mr. West said, "I did not find you in the restaurant and was really afraid lest something should have happened to you. So I decided to come and see you in the morning in order to make sure of finding you at home. Well, here I am at your disposal. I am ready to help in nursing the patients. You know that I have no one depending on me." I expressed my gratitude and without taking even a second to think replied, "I will not have you as a nurse. If there are no more cases, we shall be free in a day or two. There is one thing, however." "Yes, what is it?" "Could you take charge of the Indian opinion press at Durban? Mr. Madanjit is likely to be engaged there and someone is needed at Durban. If you could go, I should feel quite relieved on that score." "You know that I have a press. Most probably I shall be able to go, but I will give my final reply in the evening. We shall talk it over during our evening walk." I was delighted. We had the talk. He agreed to go. Salary was of no consideration to him as money was not his motive, but a salary of £10 per month and a part of my profits, if any, was fixed up. The very next day, Mr. West left for Durban by the evening mail, entrusting me with the recovery of his dues. From that day until the time I left the shores of South Africa, he remained a partner of my joy and sorrows. Mr. West belonged to a peasant family in Louth, Lincolnshire. He had had an ordinary school education, but had learnt a good deal in the school of experience and by the dint of self-help. I have always known him to be a pure, sober, God-fearing, humane Englishman. We shall know more of him and his family in the chapters to follow. Location in flames. Though my co-workers and I were relieved of the charge of the patients, there remained many things arising out of the Black Plague still to be dealt with. I have referred to the negligence of the municipality regarding this location, but it was wide awake so far as the health of its citizen was concerned. I It had spent large amounts for the preservation of their health, and now it poured forth money like water in order to stamp out the plague. In spite of the many sins of omission and commission against the Indians that I had laid at the door of the municipality, I could not help commending the solicitude for the white citizens, and I rendered it as much help as I could in its laudable efforts. I have an impression that if I had withheld my cooperation, the task would have been much more difficult for the municipality, and that it would not have hesitated to use armed force and do its worst. But all that was averted. The municipal authorities were pleased at the Indians' behavior, and much of the future work regarding our plague measures was simplified. I used all the influence I could with the Indians to make them submit to the municipality's requirement. I do not remember anyone resisting my advice. The location was put under a strong guard, passage in and out being made impossible without permission. My co-workers and I had free permits of entry and exit. The decision was to make the whole location population vacate and live under the canvas for 3 weeks in an open plain about 13 miles from Johannesburg, and then set to fire the location. To settle down under canvas with provisions and other necessities was bound to take some time, and a guard became necessary during the interval. The people were in a terrible fright, but my constant presence was a consolation to them. Many of the poor people used to hoard their scanty savings underground. This had to be unearthed. They had no bank, they knew none. I became their banker. Streams of money poured into my office. I could not possibly charge any fees for my labor in a crisis. I coped with that work somehow. I knew my bank manager very well. I told him that I should have to deposit these monies with him. The banks were by no means anxious to accept large amounts of copper and silver. There were also fear of bank clerks refusing to touch money coming from a plague affected area. But the manager accommodated me in every way. It was decided to disinfect all the money before sending it to the bank. So far as I can remember, nearly 60,000 pounds were thus deposited. I advised such of the people as had enough money to place it under fixed deposit, and they accepted the advice. The result was that some of them became accustomed to invest their money in banks. The location residents were removed by special train to Klipspruit farm near Johannesburg, where they were supplied with provisions by the municipality at public expense. The city under canvas looked like a military camp. The people who were unaccustomed to this camp life were distressed and astonished over the arrangements, but they did not have to put up with any particular inconvenience. I used to cycle out to them daily. Within 24 hours of their stay, they forgot all their misery and began to live merrily. Whenever I went there, I found them enjoying themselves with song and mirth. 3 weeks stay in open air evidently improved their health. So far as I can recollect, the location was put to flames on the very next day after its evacuation. The municipality showed not the slightest inclination to save anything from the conflagration. About this very time, and for the same reason, the municipality burned down all its timber in the market and sustained a loss of some 10,000 pounds. The reason for this drastic step was the discovery of some dead rats in the market. The municipality had to incur heavy expenditure, but it successfully arrested the future progress of plague. The city once more breathed free. The magic spell of a book. The Black Plague enhanced my influence with the poor Indians and increased my business and responsibilities. Some of the new contacts with Europeans became so close that they added considerably to my moral obligations. I made the acquaintance of Mr. Pollack in the vegetarian restaurant, just as I had made of Mr. West. One evening, a young man dining at a table a little way off sent me his card expressing a desire to see me. I invited him to come over to my table, which he did. "I'm the sub-editor of the Critic," he said. "When I read your letter to the press about the plague, I felt a strong desire to see you. I am glad to have this opportunity." Mr. Pollack's candor drew me to him. The same evening we got to know each other. We seemed to hold closely similar views on essential things of life. He liked simple life, he had a wonderful faculty of translating into practice anything that appealed to his intellect. Some of the changes that he made in his life were as prompt as they were radical. The Indian opinion was getting more and more expensive every day. The very first report from Mr. West was alarming. He wrote, "I do not expect the concern to yield the profit that you had thought possible probable. I'm afraid there may be even a loss. The books are not in order. There are heavy arrears to be recovered, but one cannot make head or tail of them. Considerable overhauling will have to be done. All this need not alarm you. I shall try and put things right at best I can. I remain on whether there is profit or not." Mr. West might have left when he discovered that there was no profit, and I could not have blamed him. In fact, he had the right to arraign me for having described the concern as profitable without proper proof. But he never did so as much uttered one word of complaint. I have, however, an impression that this discovery led Mr. West to regard me as credulous. I simply accepted Sergeant Madanjit's estimate without caring to examine it, and told Mr. West to expect a profit. I now realize that a public worker should not make statements of which he had not made sure. Above all, a votary of truth must exercise the greatest caution. To allow a man to believe a thing which one has not fully verified is to compromise truth. I am pained to have confessed that in spite of this knowledge, I am not quite conquered my credulous habit, for which my ambition has to do more work than I can manage is responsible. Ambition has always been a source of worry, more to my co-workers than to myself. On receipt of Mr. West's letter, I left for Natal. I had taken Mr. Pollock into my fullest confidence. He came to see me at the station and left me with a book to read during the journey, which he said I was sure to like. It was Ruskin's Unto This Last. The book was impossible to lay aside once I began it. It gripped me. Johannesburg to Durban was a 24-hour journey. The train reached there in the evening. I could not get any sleep that night. I determined to change my life in accordance to the ideals of the book. This was the first book of Ruskin that I had ever read. During my days of education, I have practically read nothing outside textbooks, and after I launched into active life, I had very little time for reading. I cannot therefore claim much book knowledge. However, I believe I have not lost much because of this enforced restraint. On the contrary, the limited reading may be said to have enabled me to thoroughly digest what I did read. Of these books, the one which brought an instantaneous and practical transformation into my life was Unto This Last. I translated it later into Gujarati, entitling it as Sarvodaya, Welfare for All. I believe that I had discovered some of my deepest convictions reflected in the great book of Ruskin, and that is why it so captured me and made me transform my life. A poet is one who can call forth the good latent in the human breast. Poets do not influence all alike, for everyone is not evolved in equal measure. The teaching of Unto This Last I understood to be that the good of individual is contained in the good of all, that a lawyer's work has the same value as much as a barber's, inasmuch as all have the same right of earning their livelihood from their work, that a life of labor, that is a life of the tiller of the soil and the handicraftsman, is a life worth living. The first of these I knew, the second I dimly realized, the third had never occurred to me. Until the last made it clear as daylight for me that the second and the third were contained in the first. I arose with dawn, ready to reduce the principles to practice. Okay, with this we will take a break, and we are at page 360. Yep. So what do we have to unpack in this chapter? There's not much happening here. What has happened is that a plague has struck South Africa, especially the town of Johannesburg. There are two or three important things that I can unpack from here. One is the fact that Indians, especially poor Indians, and most of them came from unindentured laborer backgrounds, were ghettoized in South Africa. They were treated as untouchables, which was ironic because that's how the Indians, and Gandhi points it out, Indian Hindus treated a lot of people in India. The Indians, the Aryas, the Hindu Aryas treated the Hindu Anaryas, as they call them, as untouchables, and they were kind of ghettoized.